Good afternoon, Year 11. So firstly, an apology. This is a slightly different version of the revision session I did this morning. Unfortunately, due to an error with Teams, it did not record correctly, so I'm just re-recording it now. The work I'm going to go through is still the same that I went through with the Year 11s this morning. There may just be a couple of small differences. First thing I want to do before we go into this too much is just give you a reminder of timings. So this is a 1 hour and 45 minute examination. You should spend 1 hour on section A and 45 minutes on section B. Within that 1 hour you should spend approximately 12 minutes reading. Question 1, which is worth 4 marks, you want to spend no more than 5 minutes on. Question 2, which is worth 8 marks, you want to spend approximately 10 minutes on. Question 3, which is worth 12 marks, you want to spend approximately 14 minutes on. And then finally, question 4, which is worth 16 marks, you want to spend approximately 18 minutes on. My advice is that you have a go at this paper in the order that makes sense to you and the order that you feel comfortable with. If that means that you start with question 5, that's absolutely fine. But do bear in mind that reading the texts may support you with the topic that you're asked to write about in question 5. In today's session, we are going to focus on question 2, question 4, and question 5. So just a very quick reminder about question 1. In question 1, you need to select 4 statements that are true. My suggestion is that before you shade in the little lozenge on that side, you simply tick or cross each of the statements on the left-hand side before committing to this, as that will just help you out with regards to any errors. Question 3 is assessing your ability for AO2, and it is looking only at language analysis. And so you want to make sure, as part of that language analysis, that you write about the correct lines and also that you make use of what, how, and why. So, like I said, in this session we are going to focus primarily on question 2, 4 and 5. Before we can do that, we do need to read the 2 texts. So it's important to remember that for this question we have 2 texts to read. One of those texts will be a slightly more modern piece of non-fiction, and one text will be a slightly older piece of non-fiction. Before you start reading, do make sure you make use of the information given at the top, because that's going to provide you with when it was written, what the topic is, and also the writer's name. So it says here, this is an article published in the Guardian newspaper in 2017. The writer Janet Davis explains the current challenges facing nurses in the UK today. So I'm going to read it through, and as I'm reading it, I just want you to be summarising what the text is about, and then we're going to summarise that into 5 bullet points at the bottom, because that's going to help us with question 2 and 4. So, there is a cure for the NHS, give nurses a pay rise. When money gets tight in the NHS, they go straight for the so-called low-hanging fruit. Politicians and economists who do not understand patient care cut the staffing bill to balance the books. Nurses, as members of one of the largest professions in the NHS, find themselves first in line. Failings at Stafford Hospital and other recent scandals have not acted as enough of a deterrent. Patients on wards feel the difference, but so does the older person waiting for the district nurse at home, and those who visit local clinics. The number of trained nurses available to work for the NHS is getting smaller, and hospitals have 40,000 fewer nurses than they say they need. The NHS turns 69 on Wednesday and has relied on the best nurses from around the world since it began. Some years ago it became an easy but short-sighted option to recruit ready-made nurses from overseas rather than train our own. with UK training based on what could supposedly be afforded, not what was needed. Consequently, not enough nurses have been trained. The government removed student funding from trainee nurses, and degree applications for this September have fallen by a quarter, with would-be mature students in particular put off by the prospect of large debts. These students, who bring a wealth of life experience to the job, often make the best nurses, and their loss will be felt acutely in the mental health and learning disability sectors. British nurses too are getting ready to move abroad. Many more are leaving nursing altogether, forced out by poor pay, the unimaginable pressure, and a feeling that they are not able to provide the safe care for the patients that they want to give. When it pays more to stack supermarket shelves than walk the wards, it is little wonder people are rethinking their career choices. The Department of Health says keeping wages down means hospitals can afford more nurses, but the 40,000 vacancies reveal the real impact. Now, in the first week since the Royal College of Nursing launched its summer of protest over low pay and unsafe staffing, there are encouraging signs that the government is changing direction. There is growing cross-party support for lifting the cap. Jeremy Hunt has told NHS leaders that he is sympathetic. When a senior MP was recently asked how a 10% pay rise for MPs was afforded, he said it had been a salary correction. Nurses are waiting for the same correction after a 14% real terms pay cut every day that the cap remains in place. The official register of those who can practice as a nurse is hemorrhaging more names than are added. The government must lift the cap and close the gap on lost earnings. So once you've read that first text, to help us with question 2 and question 4, we're just going to summarise what we've read. So I've done this in chronological order. So staffing costs often see nurses losing their jobs. There are not enough nurses, there's not enough training, too many are leaving the profession, and a pay rise is very much needed. You know, we've learned that the nurses are 14% below. So this is going to help me when it comes to question 2 and question 4. Now I'm going to read the second text and do the same. So this one is the slightly older text, and this is source B, 19th century non-fiction. Florence Nightingale is writing in the 19th century about her experience of being a nurse during the Crimean War. I always expected to end my days as hospital matron, but I never expected to be barrack mistress. We had but half an hour's notice before they began landing the wounded. Between 1 and 9 o'clock we had the mattresses stuffed, sewn up, laid down, alas, only upon matting on the floor. The men washed and put to bed, and all their wounds dressed. I wish I had time. I would write you a letter, dear, to a surgeon's heart. I am as good as a medical Times, but oh, you gentlemen of England who sit at home in all the well-earned satisfaction of your successful cases, can have little idea from reading the newspapers of the horror and misery in a military hospital, of operating upon these dying, exhausted men. A London hospital is a garden of flowers to it. We have our quarters in one tower of the barrack, and all this fresh influx has been laid down between us and the main guard. In 2 corridors, with a line of beds down each side, just room for one person to pass between and 4 wards. Yet in the midst of this appalling horror, we are steeped up to our necks in blood. There is good. And I can truly say, like Sir Peter, it is good for us to be here, though I doubt whether if St. Peter had been here, he would have said so. As I went my night rounds among the newly wounded that first night, there was not one murmur, one groan, the strictest discipline, the most absolute silence and quiet prevailed, only the steps of the sentry. And I heard one man say, I was dreaming of my friends at home, and another said, I was thinking of them. These poor fellows bear pain and mutilation with an unshrinking heroism, which is really superhuman, and die, or are cut up without complaint. The wounded are now lying up to our very door, and we are landing 540 more from Andes. I take rank in the army as a brigadier general, because 40 British females whom I have with me are more difficult to manage than 4,000 men. Let no lady come out here who is not used to fatigue and privation. Every 10 minutes an orderly runs, and we have to go and cram lint into the wound till a surgeon can be sent for and stop the bleeding as well he can. In all our corridor, I think we have not an average of 3 limbs per man, and there are 2 ships more loading at the Crimea with wounded. This is our phraseology. Then come the operations, and a melancholy, not an encouraging list is this. They are all performed in the wards, no time to move them. One poor fellow, exhausted with hemorrhage, has his leg amputated as a last hope, and dies just 10 minutes after the surgeon has left him. Almost before the breath has left his body, it is sewn up in its blanket and carried away and buried the same day. We have no room for corpses in the wards. The surgeons pass on to the next, an excision of the shoulder pain beautifully performed and going on well. Ball lodged just in the head of the joint and fracture starred all round. The next poor fellow has 2 stumps for arms, and the next has lost an arm and a leg. Excuse me. As the balls, they go in where they like and come out where they like and do as much harm as they can in passing. So again, just like with the first text, we're just going to summarise it. So this text is set during the Crimean War. There are not enough nurses, not enough facilities, death is all around them, and war is taking its toll, both on the soldiers and on the nurses. So now that we have those summaries of both texts, that will allow us to engage with question 2 and question 4. So let's start with question 2. Question 2 says, you need to refer to source A and source B for this question. So this is a reminder that you need to talk about both source A and source B. Failure to talk about both of those texts may result in you being unable to achieve more than half marks. It then tells us the focus of the question, or the summary. The conditions faced by nurses are challenging. It then states, use details from both sources to write a summary of the differences in the conditions faced by the nurses in source A and source B. That means you need to use quotations from each text whilst writing a summary to talk about the differences. There are no marks in this question for language analysis, and your best chance to get 8 marks is to keep it simple. So boil it down. It asks us about the conditions faced by nurses being challenging. So what we really want to think about is, what do I learn about the difficulties people, specifically nurses, face in each of these texts? And one way to do this is to jot down 2 to 3 ideas for each. So firstly, in the first one, we know there are not enough nurses. In fact, we're told there are 40,000 fewer than needed. This means, and this is my inference, that staff are understaffed and overworked. We also learn that nurses are underpaid. They've had a 14% real terms pay cut. This means affording to nurse is tough. We also know there's not enough training for nurses, and we could look at that section about the UK training. This means that even though there are not enough nurses, the nurses that they do have insecure knowledge. Now, if we compare that to the other extract, well, we're told again that there are not enough nurses. But it's not just nurses there are not of, there's also a lack of facility. So I wish I had time and matting on the floor. So this tells us 2 things, that it's not hygienic, but also that the nurses are overworked. We also learn that the nurses have horrific working conditions, so horror and misery, or up to our necks in blood. That's going to tell us that it would take a real tough physical and mental toll on the nurses. We can also learn that the nurses probably have a low morale. They're described as having a melancholy job, and that the list of operations is not an encouraging list. So here I've now got 6 elements that I would be able to write about. To give me the best chance to get 8 marks, I'd want to choose 2 from each column and to use those in a comparative way. So just remember, question 2, there is absolutely no language analysis, and you're best off to have it structured like this. So a statement from source A, a quotation from source A, and an inference from source A, with a connective, and then a statement from source B, a quotation from source B, and an inference. So that you do A and then you do B. Now we've talked in class a lot about what, how, why. And so these apply in that way. For the statement, it's what do you learn about the difficulties. For a quotation, it's how do you learn it. And then for the inference, it's why do you think this. So how do you understand it, not what language is being used. So let's look at an example then. In source A, one of the difficulties Davy shares with the reader is the lack of nurses in the NHS. So that is our statement for source A. 40,000 fewer than needed. That's our quotation for source A. Thus conveying to the reader that nurses are overworked as there are too few correctly trained to do the job. So that is our inference. We've then got although, so that's our comparative. Although Nightingale in source B also suggests that nurses are overworked, as she states she wished she had time, she also highlights that there is a lack of facilities as wounded soldiers are only given matting on the floor. So again, we've got our statement and we've got our quotations, and then here we've got our inferences. Therefore, clearly implying that they are provided to the heroic soldiers is subpar as a result of the poor hygiene and understaffing. So to be able to get 8 marks, you need to be able to do this twice. This first response clearly makes inferences more than one, and it also uses at least one quotation from each extract. That should give you 4 to 5 marks, but to get above 5, you need to do multiple instances. Therefore, you need to make sure that you do at least 2 of this style of paragraph, okay? So think about it as all of this is one paragraph and you need to do 2 of them, okay? So let's look now at question 4. So let's think about question 4. So this question says, for this question you need to refer to the whole of source A together with the whole of source B. A little reminder that even though it says the whole of source A and the whole of source B, it doesn't mean you need to include something from every single section of the text. It simply means your ideas can be drawn from anywhere within the text. It then tells you to compare how the writers convey their ideas and viewpoints on nursing. So the fact that it says compare means that you need to be making sure you're using connective phrases. It says how the writers convey their ideas and viewpoints, so convey means you want to be talking about language devices used, structural devices used, and even the methods used. And ideas and viewpoints is their opinions. What do they think? What do they feel? What do they believe, etc. Finally, you've got nursing here, which is the focus of the question. And therefore, that is the part that you must be making sure you're talking about. Now it says here, compare their different ideas and viewpoints. So this means that you need to talk about both of them. And we need to be using what, how, why, but we're going to do it as a tennis approach, which I'm going to share with you in just a moment. Then it says compare the methods they use to convey these ideas and viewpoints. So we need to be comparing the methods that they're using, whilst also supporting our ideas with references to both texts. Now this question is worth 16 marks, and we therefore want to spend about 18 to 20 minutes on it. Now we've obviously read the text already and we've digested it quite sufficiently, but let's think about how we can boil it down to be more specific. So firstly, we want to be thinking, well, what point are they making? Well, we know, especially from this extract here, where it says give nurses a pay rise. When money gets tight in the NHS, they go straight for the so-called low-hanging fruit. Politicians and economists who do not understand patient care cut the staffing bill to balance the books. Nurses, as members of one of the largest professions in the NHS, find themselves first in line. Failings at Stafford Hospital and other recent scandals have not acted as enough of a deterrent. So what point are they making? Well, the writer believes that nurses deserve a pay rise. The writer believes that nurses are really important to the success of the NHS. What are they thinking, feeling or experiencing? Well, actually they appear to be thinking that it's really foolish to cut nursing hours. And then how are they thinking that? Well, they use declarative phrasing, who do not. They use emotive abstract nouns such as failings and scandals, and they use imperatives such as give nurses a pay rise. So let's think about how that might look. Now, before we go into this, I just want to spend a couple of minutes to talk about a number of these other acronyms that I've started to see floating about in mock exams. Pretzel, peel, petal, pizza, all of them are doing pretty much the same job as what, how, why, except in most of these instances, if not all of these instances, they're actually far more complicated than just making use of what, how, why. Now AQA, which is the exam board that we are sitting, they've stated very clearly in their examiner reports that they prefer what, how, why. The what, how, why is the most efficient way of organising your answers to get the marks. So let's look, for example, at pretzel, which is one that I'm seeing a lot. The point and the technique are both covered in what. What point is the writer making? What technique is the writer using? The R, which is the reference, is easily covered in the how, which is your embedded quotation. Then the zoom, the explain, and the link, well, that all comes down here to the why. Now, I've also seen pretzel here with another explanation. So it goes technique, explanation, zoom, explanation, link. That would still all just be the why. Let's take pizza, for example. Your point, your evidence, what, how, your zoom in on a keyword and your analysis, well, that's your why. So don't make things complicated for yourself. Don't use those. Stick to this and think, what point is the writer making and what technique is the writer using? How are they making that point, and why has the writer made that choice? Why does it have an impact on me? Why have they used that specific word? So what we're going to do, and this is the method suggested by AQA, is that you do this as sort of a tennis approach. So you do a what for section A followed by a what for section B, a how for source A followed by a how for source B, and then a why for source A followed for a why from source B, and that you do all of that as one large paragraph. Now in the 18 to 20 minutes you want to be doing 2 to 3 of those. So what does that actually look like? Well, let's have a look. Excuse me. In source A, Davis uses factual statements to present her belief that nurses deserve a pay rise, as in her viewpoint they are essential to the success of the NHS. So clearly we can see that that is the what for source A, okay? And you can see in here that it includes factual statements, as well as making it clear that it's focusing on her belief and her viewpoint. Whereas, so that's us comparing, whereas in source B, Nightingale uses emotive language to successfully convey her opinion that the work the nurses do is vital. So nice and simply, you can see that we've got a what for source A followed for a what for source B. Then we're going to move in to those hows, the quotations. Davis states that staffing is reduced by politicians and economists who do not understand patient care, which she believes leads to failings and scandals, whilst Nightingale uses emotive phrases such as horror and misery to criticise the gentlemen of England who sit at home. So again, we can see that we've got a how for source A and a how for source B. And if we look further, we said up here that she uses factual statements. Well, that's reinforced by using that word states here. And then you can see that she zooms in on specific examples. And then we've got the same emotive phrases there, and again we've got that zooming in. Now the next bit, which is the why, that's going to be the longest section. So Davis's use of the factual yet negative phrase, who do not understand patient care, to highlight to the readers the damaging effect of reducing staffing has on patients. Furthermore, the abstract nouns failings and scandals reinforce the harm done by cutting staffing. So here, that's a very clear why for source A. And we can also see that, again, they're talking about factual yet negative phrase, and then they zoom in on those key examples. That furthermore allows some more zooming in and drilling down. Likewise, we've got another connective. Likewise, Nightingale also criticises those who do not know the first-hand experience of nurses. In her phrase, gentlemen of England who sit at home. The passive phrase, sit at home, is clearly emotive and highlights to the reader that only nurses should be trusted, especially as they are the ones who work in horror and misery. So we very clearly got our why for source B. So if we look at this in its totality, we can see that we've got 2 whats, 2 hows and 2 whys. And you need to be able to do 2 of those really large chunky paragraphs as a minimum for this question. Okay, so now let's consider question 5. So this one says, nurses deserve much better pay and working conditions in recognition of the vital work they do in saving lives day after day. Write a letter to your local MP in which you explain your views on this statement. Now you'll see from my earlier session that I've got a lot of workings out and scribbles and planning here, and I'm going to go through that again with you. As an examiner, one of the most common mistakes that I get is that students don't read this section and they end up doing a paper 1 question 4 style response for this question. Do not do that. And so the way you can avoid doing that is to make sure that you understand the path of the question. So what is the purpose, who is the audience, and what is the format? So it says here that we're explaining our views on the statement. The statement is that nurses deserve better pay and better working conditions. So my purpose here is explain your views on nurses' pay and conditions. My audience is a local MP, and then the format is a letter. Because it's to an MP, excuse me, I know it's going to be a formal letter. So what I want to make sure is that I am doing a plan. You've got 45 minutes on this question, and AQA recommend that you do 5 minutes planning, 35 minutes writing, and 5 minutes checking. The transactional text that you are being asked to write really should take you longer than the time you're given to write. So it shouldn't ever be a case that you've run out of things to write. You should almost be running out of time. So you want to get as many ideas as you can within here. So there are 2 different ways that you can plan this. You can do your 5-sentence plan, as we've talked about many times. And so those 5-sentence plans are your introduction, idea 1, idea 2, a counter idea, and a call to action. And that 5 sentences might be: nurses work hard and deserve a pay rise. Nurses sacrificed themselves during COVID. Nurses are essential workers. A counter idea could be, however, too many nurses are not well trained. And then our call to action is what we want the the MP to try and do. So here it would be campaign for better pay. that's the first way that you might choose to plan it. The second way you might choose to plan it is the method we were looking at on Friday after your exam, and that's where you have your intro, your personal idea, your general problem, followed by the general solution, the return to the personal, and the call to action. So this plan is slightly different because it allows you to be a little bit more short-handed in what you're writing. So for example, in your introduction, you're going to explain your purpose. In your personal idea, you're going to give a personalised example. Now I have a friend who's a nurse, so I would be writing about her, and I'm thinking that I would include the ideas of what I heard her life was like during COVID. I then want to introduce what the general problem is. So the general problem is that there's too few nurses, not enough training, and poor pay. My solution to that would be improved pay and better training. And then I'm going to return to the personal. So I would explain the difference this would make to Amy. And then finally, my call to action is to encourage encourage the MP to vote for a pay rise. Now you can see here in this plan, it's quite general, and it's acting more as an indicator of the things that I'm going to include. So let's start. Once I've done my plan, I do need to make sure that I set out my text correctly. Now AQA are only likely to ask you to write a letter, an article or a speech. If you got in there and they asked you to do something like a leaflet, organise it in the same way that you would organise an article. If they asked you to write a blog post, organise it in the same way as they ask you to write an article. Okay? I really doubt they'll ask you to do anything else, but both of these plans that I've shared with you today would allow you to answer this question regardless of what the text type is. Now this one's asking us to do a letter. So we need to make sure that we show the examiner that we know that your address goes in the top corner. You don't need to write it out in full, you can just write your address. And then one line below on the other side, it is their address. Again, you don't need to write it out in full, you can simply do it like this. Underneath that, you would write the date. Now you want to write the date out in full, placing a comma after the Monday. And that means that you've already correctly used a comma at this point. We then need the greeting to our letter. So if you know the name of your local MP, you can write that down. So mine is Zara Sultana. So I would start with Dear Zara Sultana. If you don't know the name of your MP, you could put Dear MP, or you could just make up a name. That's not important. What you do want to make sure though is that you place a comma after their name to once again show the examiner that you understand how punctuation works. You're then going to need to give your introduction. Now I would suggest that you don't start by saying I am here to write to. Instead, start with your personal opinion. Go in strong. So I'm going to say I am outraged that all over the UK are nurses who are the backbone of the NHS are continually experiencing hardship due to poor working conditions and low pay. So that would be my introduction. I've made it really clear at this point what it is that I'm going to talk about. So I want to introduce my personal story. So I'm going to say, please listen to this story of Amy. Now at this point I want to use a colon so I can show the examiner that in my first paragraph I've correctly used parenthetic commas, so commas as brackets. I've used a full stop correctly, a comma up here correctly, and a colon. I need to show the examiner that I can use a range of punctuation, and so I'm consciously thinking about my punctuation whilst I'm writing. So I'm going to introduce this personalised story. Now in this personalised story, excuse me, in this personalised story I want to include as much detail and as much emotive language as I possibly can. So I'm going to say Amy is a young mum who loves her job working as a nurse on a children's ward. Let's not forget our apostrophe. So here I'm trying to use a very specific example to tug at the reader's heartstrings. Then I'm going to say, however, during the pandemic, Amy had to choose between her family her son specifically, or saving the life of countless children on a COVID ward. So I've started to explain those ideas. Now I want to build on those. So I'm going to say she had to live in a hotel alone for 6 months. She had to spend 16 hours a day working in extreme conditions to save lives. She had to do it alone without the support of her family. And so now you can see here that I've used a dash to create a bit more emphasis, but I want to really kind of hammer this home. So I'm going to say, surely this level of sacrifice deserves at least some recognition. And so now I've also used a rhetorical question correctly. So I'm now up to 4 different pieces of punctuation that I've used correctly. I've also here used, again, parenthetic commas for that. And I've also used some anaphora. So she had to, she had to, she had to. So this is what we call conscious crafting. And that conscious crafting is very much about us trying to show the examiner that we're thinking really carefully about what it is that we want to say. Now I want to move on from that personal problem to the general problem. And so I'm going to write here, Amy is not the only nurse who made these sacrifices. So here I'm using a 1 sentence for effect, and then I'm going to go on to explain the general problem. So I'm going to say, over the last 10 years, nursing has become a profession that is suffering from a lack of applicants and training. So here, like I said, I've got this single sentence for effect, and then I've started here with a preposition. I've also said applicants and training. So I'm using a pair of nouns here to emphasise some of the issues. Now, unfortunately, I don't have time to write the rest of this response today. But what I would go on to do is continue this paragraph where I outline the issues with nursing. Then, in my next paragraph, I would talk about the solutions that could be put in place to improve conditions for nurses. Then I would need to go back to Amy and explain how those solutions would personally make Amy's life better. And then finally I would finish with a call to action where I encourage my MP to make the right choice and to support it. Now, because I know the name of my MP, I would be signing off my letter, yours sincerely. If I don't know the name of who I'm writing to, I finish it off with yours faithfully. Now, I've said that you're likely to be asked to write either a speech, a letter, or a newspaper article. So let's just make sure we understand how to do that. Firstly, this plan absolutely works for any text that you could be asked to write, as does the 5-sentence plan, okay? So regardless of whether you're asked to write a letter, an article, or a newspaper, this plan will allow you to do it. If you're writing an article, you need to get rid of the address, the date, and the greeting, and you want to say something like, nurses, give them a pay rise. So that would be our headline. Now, a good thing about a headline like this is, again, it allows us to use a colon correctly. Underneath our headline, we want to include a strap line, and so we might say something like, after years of austerity, the people who deserve a pay rise are those we clapped for. So by doing this, my headline and my strapline clearly give an idea. So it would then say, nurses, give them a pay rise. After years of austerity, the people who deserve a pay rise are those we clap for. And then everything else could stay the same. I'm outraged that all over the UK, oh look at that, that was the wrong one. Our nurses, who are the backbone of the NHS, are continually experiencing hardship due to poor working conditions and low pay. Please listen to this story of Amy. This is exactly why you need to make sure you've got time to check your work. So you can see that works absolutely the same. Let's say we were asked to write a speech. Well, we wouldn't include that, and we wouldn't include any of that. Instead, we might just start with good afternoon. And then again, we would carry on. The ending for a speech is simply, thank you for listening. So again, good afternoon. I am outraged that all over the UK our nurses, who are the backbone of the NHS, are continually experiencing hardship. So hopefully you can see that by using a really well structured plan, as long as you're familiar with your purpose, your audience and your format, you're going to be able to absolutely hit the criteria for paper 2 question 5. I hope that's been useful, guys. Good luck for tomorrow.